At today's Senate Rules Committee hearing, Chair Amy Klobuchar spoke in favor of the Electoral Count Reform and Presidential Transition Improvement Act. The bipartisan piece of legislation is meant to help fix the Electoral Count Act to avoid a future event like January 6th. A key provision of the bill is meant to clarify and greatly minimize the Vice President's role in the process, so that it is without question that the VP cannot block duly certified electoral votes. Klobuchar praised the legislation and recalled the horrifying aftermath of the January 6th Capitol riot. The Electoral Count Reform and Presidential Transition Improvement Act is backed by many Republicans, including Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and Missouri Senator Roy Blunt.
On Rules and Administration to consider S4573, the Electoral Count Reform and Presidential Transition Improvement Act. First, I want to thank my good friend, Ranking Member Blunt, for his leadership and his friendship, and for joining me in introducing the bipartisan manager's amendment that we will consider today. From the beginning of our work together, when Senator Blunt was the chair, to now, when I am the chair, we have strived for bipartisanship, and this is the ultimate example of that, as we have a lot of support for this bill. Now, I want to make clear that this is also the work of Senator Collins and Manchin and the group of senators that worked painstakingly for months to come to an agreement on this bill, and on this committee that includes Senator Warner, who's with us today, as well, who has a sense of history in his state, as well as Senator Capito. And we thank both of them for their work on the bipartisan group that drafted the bill before us. And I also appreciate their support, as well as Senator Manchin and Senator Collins' support for the manager's amendment. Finally, I want to recognize our good friend Senator King for his early leadership on this issue. He was ahead of his time, as always, and drafted legislation that he and I and Senator Durbin introduced in February, and a number of the provisions in that draft bill have stood the test of time and are included in both the Senate and House versions of this effort. We are here today after months of bipartisan efforts, as I noted, to find common ground on needed reforms to the outdated and antiquated Electoral Count Act. I appreciate the work of my colleagues and input we've received from experts, including an incredibly productive hearing last month. I hope this bipartisan markup will continue in that spirit, and I note that at the hearing, many of the ideas that were raised at the hearing are now in the manager's amendment. Enacted in 1887 after the disputed election between Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden, the Electoral Count Act was largely overlooked for over 130 years. But it was at the center of a plan to overturn the 2020 election and the will of the American people that, as we all know who work here, culminated in a violent mob desecrating the Capitol. On that day, enemies of our democracy sought to use this antiquated law to subvert the results of a free and fair election. They did this by making false claims that this law allowed the vice president to refuse to accept electoral votes that were lawfully cast, by recruiting state legislators to declare a failed election and appoint their own electors, and by exploiting the fact that the law allows one single senator and one single representative to object to the state's electoral votes and use baseless claims to delay the count in Congress. And I will note that this could happen. Either party could decide to have one person object or another person object, and we could literally have a delay, as Senator Blunt and I know from looking at this leading into January 6th, that could go on for day or days and days. I will never forget being there with you, Senator Blunt, and Vice President Pence at 3:30 in the morning as we walked through the broken glass and the spray-painted columns to do our job. It was silent, a stark contrast to the morning's celebratory walk with members of the Senate. While we finished our work that day, the peaceful transfer of power, which lies at the very foundation of our democracy, was at stake. And it's essential that we come together to take action to ensure that it never happens again. This bill explicitly rejects once and for all the false claims that the Vice President has authority to accept or reject electoral votes and makes it clear that the Vice President's role during the joint session is ceremonial. Second, it raises the threshold to challenge the electoral votes during the joint session of Congress to guard against baseless claims. Right now, just 2 people out of 535 members can object and slow down and gum up the counting. This bill would raise the threshold to 1/5 of Congress. Third, it ensures that partisan state legislatures cannot appoint electors themselves and ignore the will of the voters. Fourth, it makes reforms to ensure that candidates can have an appeal process. Finally, I will add that while this bill is introduced includes vital reforms that guard against future threats to our democracy, the Manager's Amendment, which we will consider shortly, includes key improvements to build on the bipartisan work and has been accepted by the leaders and the members of that group. Today, we have an opportunity to take strong bipartisan action to protect the cornerstone of our democracy, the peaceful transfer of power. I look forward to advancing this critical legislation in this committee and continuing to work with our colleagues in both chambers of Congress to pass these reforms into law by the end of the year so that nothing like the chaos of January 6th ever happens again. I now recognize my friend Senator Blunt for his opening statement.